Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 98, The Principality Governed. Happy St. David's Day to one and all from the Welsh History Podcast. It is, of course, March the 1st on 2019, for those of you wondering why I would be mentioning this. And I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're celebrating Welsh history and your Welsh ancestry or your affinity to Wales, whatever it be. As I think this is one of those fun times where we get to all sort of celebrate and enjoy something about this little nation which matters so much to so many people. And of course, when my kids were younger, they used to attend school with rugby jerseys and wearing the typical Welsh dress that you would be able to find for the girls. And it was all good fun and very entertaining, and I highly recommend people check it out. It's a little different than St. Patrick's Day or other days of the nature, but certainly has a lot of very cool aspects to it and is a very fun activity and certainly something that if you have a link to the country in some way, it helps you to understand better, I think, some of the reasons why you have that link and what's so interesting about it. So totally recommend you take part, in whatever way you can, even if it's only online. It's certainly something that's entertaining and interesting and well worth it. I should also say that congratulations are in order to the Welsh rugby team who beat England last week in the Six Nations. Again, dating this episode rather badly. It was a really good effort, and congratulations to them for sure. And obviously, yet another famous day in Welsh rugby history. Anyway, moving on. So, in the summer of 1267, Llywelyn ap Griffith was effectively crowned the Prince of Wales by treaty with the King of England. By 1268, his greatest foe, Prince Edward, was on his way to going on crusade, taking many of those who had been a problem for Llywelyn, including Roger Mortimer, and eventually possibly Gilbert de Clare, to name just two. This window of a few years would be critical in allowing Llywelyn to establish stability and, for his sake, to finally do what he had not yet been able to, which is create a family and have an heir of his own, and begin to set the stage for the succession of the Prince of Wales. To this point, Llywelyn had spent over 20 years fighting for his kingdom. This may have left little time for courting or creating the political alliances he needed, or he may just not have been interested in settling down at this point, or possibly the reality was he wanted to leave himself open because until he finalized everything, he couldn't make an alliance that was satisfactory. This will all change in the next coming decade, but change in ways that will create more problems than maybe it was worth. But nonetheless, this was something that obviously was going to preoccupy him for the coming years. While King Henry was preoccupied himself on the task of regaining his levers of power and enforcing the new reality of his leadership on his realm, which kept him obviously busy. And Edward himself was busy trying to go on crusade and trying to take the fight to the Saracens, to use that terminology. Now, however, it is time to discuss both the good and bad of the new ruling culture in the Principality of Wales, and how the treaty affected the Welsh state. In 1268, as the ruling commenced, so did the conflicts with the Marcher Lords. Certainly, even as some of them went off to go on crusade, there were still conflicts to be had. There were still issues going on amongst them. In fact, Gilbert de Clare, one of those names I mentioned, was still fighting with Llywelyn off and on. And in fact, Llywelyn would raid and pillage Caerphilly, attacking the then under construction Caerphilly Castle and destroying it. This will actually encourage de Clare to go back and rebuild the castle, and in one respect rebuild it into a much finer castle and create what we see now as the remains of the Caerphilly Castle as currently constructed. Having been there, you can see just how much the concern that the Marcher Lords must have had with Llywelyn and his ability to defeat them on the ground in open battle, because Caerphilly is a masterpiece in medieval technology. It is one of those castles where you can see why it was never taken again and why it was so dangerous on the landscape. And the only way you could really have defeated it is by a long siege without cannons and without any sort of ability to attack it from range. The castle was built in such a way that there's tiers to it, and each tier is done to build a defense, and they have moats and all sorts of different things. And then they have sub-islands which come off of the actual main island to store things on. So you have this massive protection from attack, and then a place to store your grain and your food and all of those kind of things, so that you're not starving to death. Plus you're on a water source, so you've got access to pure water. And it would make a siege there very long, very trialsome, and something which you wouldn't really want to do. And to be honest, it is a tremendous example of that technology. And certainly I would encourage anyone who's interested in the castles of Wales, that is definitely one to go check out. It is not one of Edward's castles. Of course, it was begun construction under the Marcher Lord and was actually in the March, so it wasn't a part of Wales at this point. So it doesn't have the same sort of links to that kind of Plantagenet castle building of later periods, which are obviously more about dominating the Welsh landscape and creating a sense of, I don't want to say victory, that's the wrong word, but a sense of, and domination I don't think is correct, although some would say that. I think it's more about the fact that it creates a symbol in the landscape, which it gives you the idea of this is us and we're here to stay, and you better pay attention to that. And I think that is the point of castles. It's the point of any fortification, really, is to symbolize that establishment of whatever regime has put it up, and to symbolize that they were going to be there for a while. I mean, most castles, unless they were blown up in later periods, still remain in some sense today. You can still see like Cardiff's castle or Caerphilly, or you can go to, Carnarvon, and those castles are all still around. Harlech. All of those things exist in part because they were magnificent structures that were built to serve a purpose, of course, but also as symbols on the landscape. And obviously we'll discuss how that affects the Welsh population later. But at this point in time, just so you understand, Caerphilly Castle, I believe, was built as structurally strong as it was because Llewellyn, pretty much seemingly at will, could come through and raid and pillage and take kind of what he wanted without really being struck back to this point. That will change as time goes on, of course, but at this point, he's been pretty good at winning the wars he has to fight and keeping the Marcher Lords from taking territory from him. And those battles will continue far into the future, of course, and we'll get into future conversations about that. But today our focus is more about how all of this principality worked, how the running of the government affected both the common and not so common citizen, and how the government in Gwynedd functioned on a day-to-day basis for the citizens of the Welsh Principality, in other words, the Welsh nation state that existed at this point. You have to keep in mind that what we're talking about isn't the map of Wales as we currently see it. The area that makes up the Prince of Wales's dominion is effectively only the borders of Gwynedd, Powys, the newer borders of Deuddbarth, and the lower part of Mid Wales. It's not including the areas around Dyfed or Swansea or Cardiff or what will become Newport or any of those areas, obviously, and going farther along, you're not going to have any of that because those are still a part of the March. The border areas are still dominated by the English at this point, and realistically, that is the furthest extent that the Welsh will gain as a nation state to this point. Although, obviously, calling it that is a misnomer, but it is what it is. We have to work from what we understand, and I guess, in a way. So understanding that basis and the fact that the ruling area of Wales at this point is different from what we think of. It's still important in the understanding that it was an important portion of Wales. It was the majority of Wales, to be fair, as modern borders are concerned. However, it didn't include the richer parts of the southwest and southeast. And I think that's one of the main overarching problems that Llewellyn runs into almost immediately. From a financial basis, in this period, the dominating factor on the economy is agriculture. With the exception of wool, there's very little in Britain at this point that is as dominant as agriculture. And we can argue that wool or the production of wool is a part of agriculture, but I mean more from the standpoint of growing crops and of that kind of thing. So from that standpoint, Wales didn't have that. The Principality as it stood in 1267 just doesn't have massive land that it could do agriculture. In fact, the areas that are agriculturally strong and become the breadbasket are limited in part because, of course, it's fairly hilly and mountainous. There's not loads of valleys where you can grow loads of crops. I mean, there are, and don't get me wrong, there are places where that can happen, but compared to the south, which has a lot more of those areas in abundance, that's a big difference. As well, of course, one of the aspects of that is you have the growth of Anglesey as the breadbasket of Gwynedd. It effectively grows a lot of the crops that are used by the government and by the people, and whereas the other areas become the pasture and grazing land and become better known for their milk and their meat. And so I think that side of it is interesting and intriguing because certainly it does show a difference in that respect. So let's take a look at these things, shall we? One of the harshest aspects for the Prince of Wales is in the Treaty of Montgomery of 1267 is the financial disbursement he has to give on a yearly basis for quite a long period of time. The first payment, of course, being the biggest. And of course, at that point, he probably has the ability to raise that money. But as time goes on, and as he grows in size and tries to grab more land, because he will actually spend more money to grab the land of Merdwd ap Rhys, who he then has to pay a further 5,000 marks for, just to kind of get all of this together. It's going to be costly. In total, it'll cost him about 30,000 marks. And we've talked about this in the past, just how expensive that is. And this problem would create continual issues for him, and even going so far as to cause further trouble down the road, because one of the biggest problems is of course, he must come up with this money regardless of the economy, regardless of the growing season, regardless of the warfare or building programs or whatever else he's doing at the time in leading his people. He must come up with this payment. So this will be a sign of the trouble to come. Worse yet for Llewellyn, even though he had paid this extra money for this land, he never gets it, in part because the son of Merdwd, who then takes over a year later after his death, doesn't want to be subordinate to Llewellyn and basically deserts him at the first sign of crisis, which of course would make it even more tricky, because now all of a sudden you have this area that you wanted so badly, apparently, to be amongst your liege areas suddenly becomes a constant thorn in your side and a problem, and yet you're still spending 5,000 marks for the privilege. And mixed in with all this is the fact that the English government themselves continue to sort of, if they uphold the treaty in fact, they don't necessarily uphold the treaty in spirit. They continue to hold David and Griffith in place effectively to act as a threat and a promise that they would possibly turn the control of Wales over to one of these two men, which of course would then create more problems for Llewellyn down the road, and of course leads to some of the disputes that he will have with Edward, amongst others, later. So you have that to worry about as well. So with all that in mind, and knowing the king's mentality at this point, What we need to talk about a bit is to talk about some of the local positions and local officials that would have worked for the government at this point, in part to explain kind of what their role would be, and in part to understand how things were done so that the king, for example, could get, or the prince could pay off the king and be able to finance his wars and building programs and all of those kind of things. So the first character we need to talk about is the Rhagla. Legal texts have said that this was equivalent to the mayor or the king heller, as basically the leading local official. And throughout the 13th century, this seems to be the title of importance. It goes on, in fact, after the conquest, this position still remains something of importance. And it was designated as basically a lieutenant, and that this official was effectively the prince's representative. In fact, this whole concept that he was the representative was important because what the prince wanted these men to do is represent him to the people rather than being sort of a force of their own and a force unto themselves. The scope of their authority is no more clearly illustrated than in the fact that they were the local justice for the area. They would serve out fines and punishments, or in some cases even make some of the decisions in legal cases. But typically they were mostly to issue the fines and to collect fines and from those that committed issues that needed to be worried about. They would effectively run those courts and were responsible for them. And typically they would represent the crown. Obviously, even the prince at the size of Wales isn't going to go everywhere. He's not going to be in specific territories all the time. In fact, it was, as we discussed previously, he was mandating to travel constantly so that his court could be seen in other parts of Wales. He was creating and keeping and defending areas of Wales from various marcher lords. Sometimes he was attacking them and carrying out warfare against them in the summertime especially. So thus, he didn't have a lot of time on his hands to do what kings and rulers have typically done in the medieval period, which is to act as the chief justice for the crown. And so these people would obviously be a part of this judicial administration, and the other role that they would then have is to represent and to supervise other local officials to make sure that they kept on what they were supposed to be doing, that they weren't basically losing the king or prince money. And so that was a big part of their role. And there were different people who were in equivalent positions, but nonetheless, these were kind of the highest level at a local level. Effectively, I guess you would look at them as like the mayor or the county reeve, to use Canadian terms. They would be very much in charge of that local county and cantref in this case, and would be important to it. And because they were trusted, they had a great deal of autonomy that may not have been the case for a lot of others. And conversely, of course, if stuff went wrong, they would, of course, be the ones immediately blamed. The next major official is one of some discussion, and there's debate about how much these officials actually existed or didn't exist. Certainly the role had to have existed at some point. Initially, the role of what effectively amounted to the police was kept by the army. The army was supposed to keep the peace, to enforce the peace. But you can see as the medieval period would grow, they wouldn't have the time or the ability to do that. So as they would have to, make war on others, they wouldn't have that opportunity. So one of the roles that became important as a peacekeeping in the local area would again be something called the keys. And this would be anything from taking stuff from people who had done others wrongly. You know, if you've stolen from others, your property could be seized if you committed murder. All of those kind of things could be cause for the government to seize your lands, to seize your money, and to seize your property or your possessions, and then to turn them over to the king. And this would become a bit of an issue because, of course, that's a lot of power that they had, and in certain cases would be problematic if, the wrong kind of guys in charge. And, the idea that it was these officials that were generally the chief of police, effectively. They would suppress people who were doing the wrong thing, and that was kind of the argument. But they would, in some cases, develop problems. Accusations would run about the fact that in some cases they were worse than the offenders. As you can imagine, I mean, this is a common problem that runs through the judicial police, even up to our current day. So you can imagine that if somebody had a little power and a little control and effectively could use that without a lot of oversight, things could go badly fairly quickly. And like I said, even in this day and age when, there's cameras that they have to wear and all sorts of things, police officers have problems like this. And we've seen this issue in places. Certainly this would make sense that there would be accusations at the very least, and likely reality would tell us that that would be the case. And again, that some cases these guys were just as bad as the thieves and the murderers and those that were causing problems as it does make in some sense. It was considered to be an ancient position. What that means in a medieval idea, who knows? Because we all know that ancient in medieval periods could be taken for anything that they thought was slightly old. If it was out of living memory, it could be considered ancient. So just because somebody says it's ancient doesn't mean it is. But you have to understand, and you'd have to realize at some point that these positions would become a necessity. And if the army isn't taking care of it, like in Roman times, it was the military's responsibility to keep the peace. So you can imagine that would be their general role in this period. But in Wales at this point in time, to have such a specific position, certainly it's becoming more prominent in England at this period, but with the sheriff or the shire reeve. But I think that's something we have to pay attention to. The next important point is people who are tax collectors. Obviously, as you can imagine, in any circumstance, medieval or modern or ancient, tax collectors were not probably looked on terribly fondly. They would collect taxes, fees, fares, all sorts of things. There'd be anything from, using a ferry to getting married to, fines you'd have to pay for various offenses you've committed. One of the things that they could actually gain remuneration from, strangely, is if you've had sex out of wedlock, in order to get married, you had to pay a fine. So there was that. As well, another thing that would happen is if your parent died when you were a minor, you would have to pay a fee in order to acquire their land when you gained your age of majority. So in one case that was fairly famous, it was said that it cost that person £7 to acclaim the land of his father and his uncles after they had died when he was not of age of majority, which in Wales at the time was 14. And some historians have argued that this is because that particular person had effectively become the ward of the crown. And so the argument was that he was paying for his guardianship. But I think the other thing you can start to look at as this goes along is that it's examples of Llewellyn having to try and grab more and more money to help pay off his debts. Another example of this is in the case of the way he treated places that he would go to hunt, it used to be that what would happen is that at certain points of the year, the king would go to a certain place. That would be his hunting spot. And for the time he's there, the local area would have to fund, the food and various things. They'd have to pay a food rent effectively to help upkeep all these men and equipment. Like it was said, that can be hundreds of people. Followers, hangers-on, officials, military men who were protecting the prince, and all of that kind of thing. But with Llewellyn, he charged that even if he didn't show up that year. With previous princes, they didn't necessarily charge that amount if they didn't show up. Obviously, that's a tough thing to ask somebody to do, especially if you're not even going to be there to hold this aside and to give it to you after the fact. So this expectation that they would have to pay regardless, again, I think it looks in part to a changing system, but I think it also looks to the part that he's having to make these payments on an annual basis, and they're massive payments. They're not small, and I think he's looking for ways to gain that money. Another thing that they did was there was accusations that Llewellyn raised money on a tax by head basis. So if you had, certain servants, for every servant you had to pay this much tax. And the argument there was it something that was new, or was it something that was always there, but all that happened was Llewellyn expected you to pay more because the one specific town that's mentioned, it was 3 pence a head, where people were shocked and appalled. But were they shocked and appalled because they were being charged 3 pence a head, or was it because it used to be 1 pence a head or a half penny a head, and now all of a sudden they're being expected to pay 3? That's the part that unfortunately our records don't tell us a lot about and can't inform on us enough to give us a good understanding of that. Again, the other interesting thing that I found in researching this that I think is really interesting is the king would also, or the prince in this case, would also seize any shipwrecks or any treasure that was found on land that wasn't yours. And in the case of a shipwreck, if it was yours, unless you could prove that it wasn't shipwrecked, you lost it. And in fact, this will create problems with some of the English lords down the road, because Llewellyn just kept that. And again, this is a change. It wasn't always this way, but Llewellyn had changed it. And I think, again, we're looking at a situation where, because even that's not like everybody shipwrecks every day or something. So it's not money you would get on a consistent basis. So the fact that he would do this would go, I think, again, to show that there was a financial issue. And because of the financial issue and the straps that it put upon the nation, he went to desperate lengths to continue to collect that money. And all of this, of course, would come down to the local officials and how diligent they were. And we don't know, we know what's expected of them, but the reality of it is we don't know, did that police officer always work well? Did that local tax collector actually collect the taxes he was meant to collect? Or did he keep some of it? Or, and all those kinds of things. And the other thing we have to understand is the taxes at this point are not necessarily financial. They're still food and milk and grain and clothing and all these other things that could be used. But there was definitely cash involved as well. If you made trades, if you had a port city, there was a big thing with gaining money off of the markets, and anything that went into the market had to pay taxes and fares and fees. So you had every step along the way, the prince was collecting money. And again, as I said, in all likelihood to pay off the king, but in all likelihood also to pay off a fairly healthy building project platform, which was the Welsh, much like the Plantagenet English, were building castles. They were building these structures, centralizing things, and starting to urbanize into by degrees. The rural Wales of so long was starting to come to an end with the start of the market towns, with the beginnings of castles. All of these things have become more important, and really modeling their English overlords, for lack of a better phrasing, because, of course, you can see the advantages that gives you from a taxation standpoint. It's a lot easier to gain taxes from people that are in one small location than to try and gain it from people who are spread all over hither and yon. I mean, there are people that may live their entire lives having never interacted with a single official because they're up in the mountain ranges raising sheep, whereas somebody living in, say, Carnarvon, which, may have been a nothing town at this point, but if they're living in places like that, all of a sudden they become taxable. They are easy to talk to. They're easy to enforce your rules, and of course they would look at it as an advantage of being safe from robbers and all these various reasons why people would move there. And obviously the economy and the economic advantages would be there too. And we'll talk about this, of course, as we go more into the English period. There are definite things that start to happen in Wales which really hadn't happened to that point. But you can see the beginnings of it during this period. I mean, the 13th century, all the way through, you see Wales becoming more and more like the rest of the medieval world and very much aligned with what was going on in the medieval world. They weren't somehow exceptions to the rule. They were just the same and just as a part of it as anybody else. So with all that in mind, have yourselves a great day. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod. I try and answer questions as soon as they're sent. Sometimes I'm a little slow. Please keep that in mind. If you don't get an answer straight away, it is coming. I guarantee it. As well, you can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, if you'd like to support our podcast, you can always do that on Patreon at Welsh History. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care. Have a great day and enjoy your St. David's Day. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production. And for everything we do, check out distractionsmedia.com.
I'm Daniel Norcross.
And I'm Rory Dollard.
And between us, we are England Cricket on 99.94.
We'll be every week looking at the ups, the downs, the runners, the riders, the news and the views on all things English cricket.
And believe you me, there are plenty of ups and downs. Join us, England Cricket, on 99.94.